Okay, we're going to look at food and resources in this module. First, we're going to cover the food part. This is pretty, well, I guess it's pretty straightforward. It's fairly common usage. And then we're going to get into this sort of larger issue of resources. Food, of course, being one of the central resources, because without food, you're not around here anymore. So let's look at the various sectors, what we call usually called agricultural sectors. Most importantly, it's just these are the way not only that people collect what they eat, but it's also the way they see the landscape. Because when you go through these changes in terms of how you acquire food, you also change the way you look at the world around you. So on one hand, they're fairly straightforward. On the other hand, they're actually sort of, you might call the tip of a very complex iceberg of perception, decision making, etc. So the most basic one of these, and this is actually central to the human existence, the human species as a species is very successful, obviously. But one of the major reasons for the success really isn't thought through very well. And that's the fact that we are a collective species. We act in groups, very similar to, for example, some of our relatives like the baboons and macaques and such. So we're not effective as individuals. Individual humans are not particularly well designed in the sense that they don't have high speed, they don't have particularly good hearing, they don't have, they're just not, they're sort of like a Swiss Army knife of stuff rather than something very specialized. So there's always another organism, in many cases another mammal, that does whatever we do in that particular sector better than us. But what we do have is we have built over, last 500,000 years or whatever, is basically the ability to work effective in groups. So humans are designed, one, to be group animals. We're designed to work effective as teams. And this makes us different than a lot of things. And this is why humans and collectively can kill lions, but lions have a hard time going after people. Lions are much more powerful, have no trouble hunting a person down. But if you've got a group of 20 or 50 people, that lion's in trouble. And so this is the key to our original design that basically makes us what we are. So this is what we call hunting gathering. And this is what the human species did. And this is what made us the dominant species on the planet, was our ability to basically move through a landscape, hunt the animals that we want or can catch, which aren't necessarily a lot, but there's enough of them. But also, of course, we can design traps, spears, bows and arrows, all sorts of other ways to catch things. And then also then it's to gather whatever, say agricultural products like fruit or nuts or whatever is on the landscape. This is what we do. And this is why we have eyes at the front of our face. This is why we have opposable thumbs. This is why we're omnivorous. There's a lot of stuff that if you think about you can eat that your dog or cat will die from. There's almost nothing that your dog and cat would eat that would kill you. So we're sort of like a mammal version of a cockroach. We're very much what we call a generalist. But our key factor is basically our ability to work effectively in groups. So hunting gathering was basically family or small groups moving all across landscapes, taking advantage of what was there. Again, given the intelligence level and the fact that you're working in teams, right from the get-go, what you had was people moving on landscapes that would vary from season to season. So they'd move from one landscape to another landscape as seasons change, and then something comes into fruit, for example, or all of a sudden animals are breeding, so they're easier to catch, and then moving to another landscape as those conditions change. So what you're talking about are fairly small populations, probably, if you look at our relatives, probably in the range of anywhere from 10 to 40 or 50, usually related in some way, shape, or form, and then moving around in a nomadic fashion on the landscape. And that's why we are what we are. That's why we stand upright. And basically all the things you see in the modern human species were designed to be the most effective hunter-gatherers in teams of any species on the planet. And that's what we're good at. Now, of course, the minute you take that lifestyle away, then you've got problems. So, if you're looking at things like obesity or arthritis or all sorts of stuff like that, that's in many ways a result of what happens when you take the hunter-gatherer out of a hunting-gathering environment. Once people aren't moving around, once they aren't eating that very diverse mixed diet and such like that, then all of a sudden all those physiological parameters that made us successful aren't really in play much anymore. When you go down to McDonald's to get something to eat, you're not a hunter-gatherer. So hunting-gathering is actually what made the human species dominant. Having said that, hunting-gathering isn't really practiced by any population on the planet today. There's some folks that still do it part-time, but hunting-gathering is not around as the only subsistence system in any population on the planet. What happens is this hunting gathering gets replaced by what we call shifting cultivation. And again, as people were observing the landscape they were moving across. So for example, we said just hypothetically Pololo here. So you're on this Kalaipohaku side of Pololo, and you notice that the guavas, are in fruit right now. So you start to eat guavas. And then the guavas, they seasonally, stop producing guavas. So you're looking at the Wilhelmina sign on the other side of the valley, and you realize the guavas over there grow later than they do here. So what you do is you eat the ones here, then you move across the valley and eat the ones over there. And then some genius in your group realizes that, if you don't eat all the guavas, some of the ones that follow you around sprout, and you see little baby guava trees there. And so they come up with the idea, well, rather than walking around Pololo all over the place, why don't you actually take some of these little guava seedlings and move them around to someplace you really like that's really comfortable and plant them there. So what you do is you take parts of your existing environment, but you actually start physically moving the plants and maybe even the animals around from one location to another to make it more convenient. So you don't have to walk as far. Now, if you end up with a very rich environment, which you do in a lot of places, most famously the Pacific Northwest, where basically the diversity of your food environment was such that you could basically move things around and actually live in settled villages without having to, quote, farm, unquote. This was actually fairly common. This is a huge change mindset-wise, because now rather than having to go from point A to point B, because that's where the food is, now you've come up with a concept, well, I don't have to go where food is. I can actually move potential food areas around me, and as long as the condition's right, now I'm going to get the same amount of food, but I don't have to walk as far. Or maybe it's not as risky, whatever it might be. This is what we call shifting cultivation. Now, the key with this is sometimes it's called swidden or slash and burn, is you then have to start modifying the environment. So if you think about the hunter-gatherer, you don't modify it, you're just living within the environment. In a shifting cultivation system, you're starting to manipulate the environment. You're not necessarily manipulating the landforms too much, but you're manipulating the plants and maybe even the animals that are on the landforms. And what you very frequently then realize, and this is still actually done in a lot of places, is if there's been a fire, the plants that grow up in a spot after there's been a fire are very different than the plants that were there if that area hasn't burned in, say, 50 years. And so what you realize is, if what you want to grow grows better after there's been a fire, at some point, why wait for Mother Nature? Once you figured out how to have fire around yourself anyways, why not set a fire somewhere, burn that area off, then bring the plants that you want, plant them in this newly burned area, and bang, you've got two things. One is you've cleared it with the use of fire. Secondly, you've provided fertilizer in the soil to plant what you want there. Hang on a sec here. Sorry, doing deals. So shifting cultivation is basically the next stage, but it's also a perceptual thing. You now look at the landscape in terms of a land that has opportunities, but you're now giving yourself the ability to manipulate the landscape. It's only maybe with fire and moving plants around, but still a huge conceptual change. But before, if you think of a hunting gathering, that's sort of like playing the game Monopoly. If you think of a really ancient game, the board's out there, the rules are out there, it's all structured, or Warcraft or anything like that. All that stuff is basically you're just moving through it. But you're only active in the sense of taking advantage of what's given in front of you. In a shifting cultivation system, now your perceptual patterns very much change. It's like you can look at the landscape, well, what can I do with this? How can I feed my family? If this is a really nice place, I can have the food and I can actually now build a house, which means I can now have more technology because I don't have to pack everything on our backs and hump it across the countryside. So shifting cultivation was one of the enormous changes in human societies. It occurs about 15, 20,000 years ago, we think, roughly. And it made a massive change because all of a sudden, among other things, you now have more food. The food's more predictable because you know where it's going to be, when it's going to be, which also means now your populations increase. So this has a huge impact on the human, you might say, human impact on the environment changes radically. The next stage of this is intensive agriculture. So this is where you basically expand this idea of rather than just moving existing plants around. Now you start to manipulate and modify, if you would, you domesticate your plants and your animals. So rather than just taking guava, for example, now you would manipulate guava so it becomes bigger and you can use it more, and it's more per plant or whatever it is you want out of it. And you do that through classical Mendelian genetics. Remember your like high school or grade school biology, and that's intensive agriculture. Now you've gone further down that street of change though, because now you're spending more time on the crops. So the crops now become more important to you. So now almost guaranteed you've got what you might call you're now a farmer. So now you've got settled pieces of property, your best land. You put your crops on the best land. You now have more food per acre, so you don't need to farm maybe as much property as you did before. You get more food per acre, so it's good. You can have more people, you have more resources, you have more surplus. But it also means that your populations again are probably going to increase. And ironically, because you've now started to modify the plants and or the animals, is they now become more vulnerable. As you start to increase how much food you get for plant, for example, it's going to require more water. It might require more likely will require more fertilizers. It's very likely that there's more pests that might find the bigger, fatter version of the plant more interesting than the original small, sort of natural version of the plant. So all of a sudden your risk has started to increase. If the rains don't fall on time, if you don't have access to fertilizers, or also if the pest like locusts or something hit, now you're completely shafted. Whereas before, since you were operating on plants that existed in the environment, you weren't really that hyper attractive to those things. And it was less vulnerable because the plants already exist in that world. So they're less prone to drought, et cetera, et cetera. So intensive agriculture is a very dramatic move. On one hand, you're increasing again the amount of food you generate. So all of a sudden, again, your population begins to escalate. But on the other hand, the chance of something going wrong has also escalated. So it's always a trade-off. And that's the important thing to remember when you're looking at all these food sectors. There's always a trade in terms of what you get versus what you potentially lose, you might think. Now, what you find is a subset of this, which is folks which basically do somewhat the same thing. But what they do is rather than modifying plants, is you modify animals. And so what you do is you basically take animals that exist in that environment, you modify them, maybe semi-domesticate them in many cases. A yak is a real good example. And what you do is you actually take those animals and you now run those animals across the landscape, and you basically follow herds of animals. You take the milk from those animals, you take the resources from the animals, and that becomes your lifestyle. So basically, as we call this pastoral nomadism. You usually have some farming, sort of shifting cultivation that you're doing on the side, because it's very rare that you can actually get everything from animals. But the vast majority of your world is actually based on your animals. As your animals have to move from one spot to another for grazing or for water, because the temperature changes, winters, for example, then you have to move with them. So you keep the nomadic lifestyle you had in the hunting gathering phase, but now it's a much more complex lifestyle because it's tied to both, part-time farming. But even more importantly, it's tied to these large herds of animals. And again, the Mongols would be one of the classic examples of this in terms of pastoral nomadism. So it's usually running in parallel to intensive ag. As people become more specialized as farmers, what you find is a subcategory of folks that basically go and become what you might call specialized as folks that run around with semi-domesticated animals. Fairly common in a lot of parts of the world. And this leads to, again, huge environmental changes because you start to have large numbers of a particular species of animal. They're going to have a hell of a lot more impact in the environment than just a few did. Good example would be nomadic populations in North Africa, which end up basically living this lifestyle, but they do it with goats, which are an incredibly destructive animal. Now, goats existed in North Africa for probably millions of years, but there are only a few of them. When you suddenly have these, which you have some guy bringing in basically 500 goats into a hillside, and within literally a day or two, everything's gone. So he's constantly having to move around because these goats are just basically vacuuming up the landscape. One or two goats, the landscape can handle. The landscape can't handle 500 goats. So what you get is pastoral nomadism doesn't mean you're living within the environmental conditions. It just basically means that you're moving through the environmental conditions fast enough that it doesn't kill you. Now, the last of these is commercial agriculture. Let me just do a quick switch here. Give me a second. Okay, wait a second. Okay, this image, I just pulled this off a Google search. This particular image is really, really key because if you look at this, think of the difference between this and someone who's got a half-acre farm behind their house. So they go out every day and they're going and basically out in that area, they're working in that area, they're planting it by hand, maybe they've got a water buffalo or a cow or something like that, but it's all hand done. And pretty much if you're a regular small-scale farmer, which would be traditional intensive agriculture, most of what you grow is actually for your consumption of your family. If you've got surpluses, you then trade those or sell those to other folks, but it's what you're talking about is sustainable agriculture in the sense of subsistence agriculture. The function of the farmer is to feed their family. In this image, if you look at this, this is not someone feeding their family. You know, as you can see all the way into the distance, it's basically this huge, giant field system. This is something that your entire function is to grow stuff. This is basically an agricultural factory. So when you're looking at this type of image, what you're actually looking at is a very, very different way of dealing with the world around you. You know, it's, on one hand, it's compelling, but on the other hand, this, if you think of that gain and loss or gain and risk, now you're generating huge amounts of food. It's highly mechanized. So you can, you know, you might have maybe this entire farm all the way out to this edge here might only have, you know, 3 to 5 people working it because it's all done with large mechanized equipment, or now it might be robots. So you've got this system that basically functions, but this thing needs a lot of water. You need to have access to fossil fuels. You know, from a pollution standpoint, this is really sketchy versus a small farm because you have to have enormous amounts. This guy's probably spraying fertilizers right here, or else insecticides to handle, you know, the growth of these. And on top of that, of course, from just a pest standpoint, now you've got this lily almost to the horizon. You've got one plant growing, which means if there's a particular insect or something that likes to eat that day, they've just hit the jackpot when they find the spot, because it's basically one giant chunk of food from one end to the other. So, you know, you're incredibly desperately vulnerable to water, to things like temperature, to storms, to insects. So on one hand, it is like Vegas. You know, on one hand, you're gambling. If you win the gamble, which you do maybe most of the time, you've got an enormous amount of food that's available, which then you can sell globally. In fact, in many cases, this might not even be a food. This might be an example of soybeans grown in the Midwest, which actually certainly looks like it might be. And soybeans are not something that Americans actually eat very much. So if you're a farmer growing soybeans, you aren't probably, if you're a Midwestern farmer, you probably don't eat those soybeans. They don't do edamame in the Midwest. So, you know, what you're actually doing is you're actually growing these for the purpose of selling the entire crop. With the money you make off of selling the soybeans, you know, go to Whole Foods or Times or whatever the version, Safeways, and you buy the food that you want to eat. So you don't eat what you've grown, you sell what you've grown. Now, this could easily, for example, be cotton, or it could be coffee, which you can't eat. So, you know, in agribusiness, it is really production in the classic sense of you know, economic global production systems. So whoever's driving this tractor, if he owns this farm, he's competing with everyone else in the world that grows this particular crop. And he's trying to sell his for as much money as possible. And with that, he'll not only pay for the equipment and the land and the water and all the rest of it, but he'll pay for his house, his car, his kids' education at Chaminade, and the food that they consume. So it really is a factory. It's not production in the classic sense. This is not what you'd call subsistence agriculture. In some ways, it's not even particularly sustainable. And I don't care whether you're doing, you know, a non-GMO version of it or a non-pesticide version of it, it's still an agribusiness. So when you've shifted into this, which is what most of the world is in now, you're now in global competition, global, you know, demand for product or global lack of demand. And, you know, literally, if all of a sudden folks, for example, in the world decide they don't want cotton anymore for clothes, and that's what you grow, then all of a sudden you're bankrupted basically in a year or two. Whereas before, if you were just an intensive agricultural farmer with like an acre or two, you just plant a different crop. And to a certain extent, you don't care because you're eating the food that you're growing. Yeah, now you don't have any surplus that someone wants to buy. You're eating it all, but you still can feed yourself. This guy, if this crop goes south for some reason, he's going to starve to death. Now, he's a farmer, but he's got almost nothing in common with that traditional farmer.